In this video, we're going to talk about federalism. There are different ways of dividing decision-making power, for example, between a legislature and a prime minister or a president. But there are other ways of dividing power too. If we think about a state, who should have jurisdiction over things like national defense? What about transit policy and the routes that buses or subways take? Education, schooling, universities? What about official languages? Things like road maintenance or highways. For some of these domains, it might not make sense for a national government to be in charge of those things. It might make more sense to delegate some of that decision-making power to subnational units. And we call that system federalism. And that's exactly how we want to define federalism. It's some kind of division of power between a national government and then subnational units. A national government for large national things and smaller local or regional governments for things that are closer to the local population. These could be provincial, state, regional, or even municipal. Now, different federal arrangements can disperse powers differently. Some might be very centralized with the national government holding a lot of power, and others might be decentralized, where a lot of power is given to the subnational units. We could also have cooperative federalism, where the different parts work together quite seamlessly, or coercive, where there's a lot of friction between the central government and the subnational units. There are around 25 states, give or take, depending on how you want to divide them, that use federal systems of government. India, Brazil, Germany, Mexico are all states that use some type of federal arrangement. Now, where did the idea of federalism come from? It's one of those ideas that sort of emerged on its own in a few different places. Johann Althusius was a German philosopher, and he wrote about federalism back in about 1603. And his observation was that all large states are actually communities of communities. A town or village is groups of families. A province is groups of towns and villages. A republic is groups of provinces, and so on. And he felt that this was just the natural order of things. It was a natural way to organize political communities, was a federal system, groups of groups. Now, in North America, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was very influential for the Canadian and American Constitution. They noticed that the nations of the Haudenosaunee, the 5 different nations, all were independent nations, yet sometimes they got together where their interests aligned. And so that was the inspiration for, again, those 2 constitutions. Also in France, Montesquieu, in his book The Spirit of the Laws, wrote about the idea of the Confederate Republic, and he drew inspiration from places like Switzerland, Germany, and the Roman Empire. And he observed that this was an important source of unity and stability. By giving regions some degree of autonomy, it actually helped get their buy-in and keep the republic or the political community stable. Now, what about contemporary examples? Canada is a textbook example of a federal system. There is a national government, a parliament, and there are provincial legislatures. The national parliament is in charge of things like national defense, shipping, navigable waters, transit policy, the banking system and currency, elections, and the Constitution gives them power over something called peace, order, and good government for the nation. Now, the provincial legislatures are in charge of delivering health care, education, and natural resource exploration in the provinces. Now, there are also, while those responsibilities are defined pretty explicitly, there's also the notion of reserve powers. What's left over? The Constitution divides powers between them, but what about stuff that's not on the list? What about stuff that comes up later? Well, the Canadian system is highly centralized in the fact that it gives reserve powers to the national government. If we didn't mention it in the Constitution, it is automatically the jurisdiction of the federal parliament. The United States, very similar structure. They have a Congress and a president that represents the national government, and then they have states, and each state is a state legislature. In all federal systems, you want to think of it like this. The citizens will vote for the national government, but separately they will also vote for their provincial or state governments as well. The American national government is in charge of defense, the currency and the monetary system, and immigration. The state governments, by comparison, have a lot of power. Business and commerce, the education system, they regulate and charter banks in each state. Law enforcement, there's about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, most of them at the state level. And then elections as well. Elections are conducted differently in each state. So In this system, slightly different than the Canadian example, reserve powers go to the state governments. So this is a highly decentralized federation. The Constitution lists a bunch of powers. Anything that's not listed, by default, goes to the states. Now, why do some places use federalism as a system of government, yet others don't? Well, it's a good fit for places with a large geographic area. When we look at Canada and the United States, there's a lot of regional variation. So by giving regions some autonomy, they can account for those differences in things like climate or the economy that might be different. You also could have different ethno-linguistic minorities. In Canada, the Quebec province speaks French, and they have an entirely different approach to language rights and society and culture. And so therefore, a federal system is a good way of giving them some kind of autonomy within the broader federation. Different religious communities. Lebanon experimented with federalism and how to balance the needs of different religious groups. And ultimately, federalism is a way of distributing political power. When you've got these different groups, whether they be linguistic groups, ethnic groups, regional factions, federalism is a good way of distributing political power and keeping people happy. Another example of a federal system is Belgium. Belgium's got pretty much all of the above here. It has two large linguistic blocks and kind of a third linguistic block as well. It has the Dutch-speaking north, the French-speaking south, and there's a little German-speaking part over in the east as well. And then, of course, there's their capital. They have different levels of government for different purposes. There is a national government. There are linguistic community-based governments, and then there's also regional ones as well. So it's basically a combination of 6 different governments. And that's one way that federalism can get pretty complicated when you've got lots of different layers of decision-making power. So just to recap, federalism is an arrangement whereby powers are divided between a central government and subnational units. The axis for division could be geographic, it could be regional, linguistic, religious. There's lots of different ways that power could be divided. Very good for states that are large geographically or states that have a lot of multinational or ethno-linguistic differences within them. Good way of trying to balance different interests.